My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
After taking an extended look into the history of Led Zeppelin, we now return to our original Sound Stories format of doing a deep dive into an important or at the very least interesting album, which I might be sticking with for a little bit, although I do have some ideas about some different things I can do here time allowing, which is mainly just a question of can I find enough time to research and do potentially multi-part deep dives on things in between the mainline episodes or not. Regardless, this time, as you've probably guessed from the title telling you what the episode is about, I'm going to be talking about Metallica's fourth album, And Justice for All. Before we get started though, first as always I want to acknowledge my sources, which included articles written by the likes of Mick Wall, John Widerhorn, Joel McIver, Paul Brannigan, Corey Groh, Greg Kennelly, Karen Gibson, and Jackson Maxwell, working for a variety of publications and websites, all of which will, like always, be listed on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all that being said, let's begin. Now, I have previously covered Metallica on this podcast. The first time was in my History of Thrash Metal episode, the remaster of which should be coming out this month, and I also did a Sound Stories episode on their album that came out immediately before this one, Master of Puppets, an episode which ended with the tragic death of their 24-year-old bass player Cliff Burton, who was killed as a result of a crash involving their tour bus in the middle of the night, a crash that resulted in the young man being thrown from his bunk through a window and eventually crushed by the very same tour bus he had just been in. This was, as you might imagine, a devastating loss for the other members of Metallica, who were in no way emotionally equipped to deal with it. For example, guitarist Kirk Hammett, who had switched bunks with the bass player on that fateful night, could not for a time go to sleep without a light on, potentially indicating some kind of PTSD, while rhythm guitarist and singer James Hetfield would respond to his friend's death by breaking 2 hotel windows the following night before wandering the streets of the city they were in, shouting Cliff's name as if it was simply missing. This was a truly uncertain time for Metallica. Master of Puppets had seen the band at the height of their creative powers as they pushed the boundaries of thrash metal. They had created a memorable album that saw the band on the verge of superstardom, as it would be their first record to go platinum, and it would also lead to them opening for one of their heroes, Ozzy Osbourne. Yet, just as they seemed about to become this massive success, the aforementioned tragedy had struck. And understand, this was more than just losing a friend and a bass player. Cliff's influence on the band that Metallica had become was tremendous. All 3 of the other members of Metallica were fairly raw as musicians to one degree or another when the band started. Cliff, though, with his knowledge of classical music, jazz, and music theory, led the band to experiment with different tempos, song structures, harmonies, and counter-harmonies, which is why there's such a growth from Kill 'Em All to Ride the Lightning. Cliff then was a major driving force behind the direction of the band, and now he was gone. Despite this loss, Metallica, with apparently the blessing of Cliff's family, opted to press on. As such, they reached out to the founder of Metal Blade Records, Brian Slagel, looking for suggestions of bass players they could audition. They would go through a reported 40 or so individuals, which included 23-year-old Jason Newsted of Flotsam and Jetsam, who was among the names Slagel had suggested. Now, keep in mind, all of this was happening very fast. Indeed, Jason's audition took place just 3 weeks after Cliff's funeral, so I'd imagine this was a bit of an awkward situation. Still, Jason was a massive Metallica fan, calling them his favorite band of all time. Indeed, when they asked him what song he wanted to play for his audition, Jason answered, quote, "Anyone you like, I know them all." The remaining members of Metallica then were impressed by his knowledge, his playing, and his enthusiastic, positive attitude, so they gave him the job. The thing was, while Jason could hold his own as a bass player, he wasn't just replacing any bass player. He was replacing Cliff Burton in Metallica, and the role of Cliff was an impossible one to fill. As again, Cliff was more than just a bass player and a friend, he was also like a mentor. He was almost an older brother type figure and a kind of guiding force for the band. As such, Jason would be endlessly hazed as the others didn't really seem to give him a chance. This included, but was not limited to, stuff like constantly waking him up in the middle of the night by banging on his door so hard it almost came off its hinges. They'd also physically pull him out of his bed and do stuff like toss his clothes, shoes, and cassette tapes out of windows. They were also known to cover his mirrors with shaving cream and squirt toothpaste all over his room. They also reportedly had a tendency to introduce Jason to strangers as being gay, which, seeing as how this was the 80s, was meant to be seen as shameful and humiliating. Behavior that the others would seemingly eventually come to regret, as in 2005 Hetfield would admit, quote, "There was a lot of grief that turned into spite towards Jason," seemingly recognizing that how they had treated Jason was wrong, and also not about him so much as being about the loss they had experienced. Similarly, Lars in 2009 would say, quote, "We were 22 years old and we didn't know how to deal with this type of stuff. We didn't know how to get through these type of situations, other than jump to the bottom of a vodka bottle and stay there for years." Yet, despite their loss, their inability to deal with it properly, and the hell they were putting their new bass player through, the band had to press on. You see, while the European tour they had been in the middle of when the accident happened could be delayed, their upcoming first tour of Japan could not, which led to a situation that Ulrich would describe, quote, "We laid Cliff to rest a week or two after the accident, and then there wasn't 5 minutes after that to process it, because if we slowed down, we were afraid we were going to disappear into nothingness, or go so far into the abyss that we wouldn't be able to pull ourselves up." Metallica didn't want to call it a career and just give up. They refused to just fold and call it a day, which Lars has insisted they did as much for Cliff as for anything else, as he has declared that if Cliff, quote, "knew we were sitting around feeling sorry for ourselves, he'd come around and kick us in the ass, and tell us to get back out on the road and continue where we left off." So, with Metallica opting to push ahead, the pressure was on to follow up their successful and highly considered Master of Puppets album. The thing was, at this time, they really were in no state to do any such thing. You see, as they attempted to write songs for the new album, they really seemed to struggle without Cliff's influence. Their first attempt at writing in the summer of '87 bore little fruit, as they only managed to come up with one song, Blackened, a song that is especially notable considering how the rest of the album would go, because it would be none other than their new bass player Jason Newsted who provided the main riff for the track. Newsted had just been playing around with a riff on his bass, not thinking too much about it, until James Hetfield started copying what he was doing on his guitar, declaring excitedly that the riff was good enough to open their next album. Again, though, this moment of inspiration was the only one that came out through these initial sessions. Work on the album then was going nowhere fast. Plus, they also had the question of their upcoming appearance at the Monsters of Rock Festival at Castle Donington, a major event that their new European label thought it would be great if they had something to release to capitalize on. Realizing that a full-fledged album wasn't going to happen in time, they instead proposed the band write and release a single, but Metallica rejected the idea, with Lars proclaiming defiantly, quote, "We don't do singles." Still, there was pressure to do something, and they didn't want that something to require much thinking. They just wanted to do something that would allow them to let loose and try and have a bit of fun, which is what led to the creation of the Garage Days Revisited EP, which itself was a reference to a single released by their former British label Music for Nations that had packaged Creeping Death with covers they had done of Blitzkrieg's Blitzkrieg and Diamond Head's Am I Evil. The idea then was Metallica would again be revisiting their Garage Days by hammering out a series of underground metal and punk songs that had inspired them. This included once again paying homage to their heroes Diamond Head with a cover of their song Helpless, a cover of another Nawabam band Holocaust The Small Hours, followed by English rock band The Killing Joke's The Wait, which was followed by a cover of Welsh metal band Budgie's Crash Course in Brain Surgery. The EP would then wrap up with a pair of songs by the Misfits, a band that had been a favorite of the departed Cliff Burton. As Metallica got ready to produce this fun, no-thought-needed EP, they found they were not comfortable in the fancy Marin County rehearsal studio they first attempted to gather in. So instead they fittingly retreated to an actual garage in drummer Lars Ulrich's new rental home to rehearse, the garage having been soundproofed by new bass player Jason Newsted, who had volunteered for the job due to his background in carpentry. Following these rehearsals, the band quickly recorded and mastered the whole EP in 6 days in LA's Conway Studios. The final product then was raw and lo-fi, which explains the credit of being not very produced by Metallica. Also notable was the fact that Jason Newsted was credited as being Master J. Newkid in an apparent continuation of the hazing process. The EP, though, despite being all covers and its raw lo-fi production, still sold exceptionally well, going gold in the US and making it up to 27 on the UK single charts. Part of this success would be credited to Lars's willingness to do interviews with various media outlets to promote the EP, which included going above and beyond by talking to any number of fanzines in addition to the bigger, more well-known publications that you would expect. A phenomenon that I have a feeling may have been due to the fact that Lars's own heavy metal fandom had been fed by such fanzines, so getting the chance to interact with them was probably a lot of fun for him. With the EP recorded and released on the world, it was time for Metallica to head off for the Monsters of Rock festival in Donington. First, though, Metallica would decide to do an unannounced warm-up show at London's 100 Club. Appearing under the name Damage Inc., they would perform an hour-long set in the crowded and extremely hot locale, during the end of which Newsted's bass cut out. Now, the real reason for this was just some technical glitch, but word would spread claiming that the bass had cut out because Newsted had passed out from the heat. Now, where the story came from is unclear, but it is suspected that it might have been planted by other members of Metallica as a dig against the new guy, as a way of suggesting that he could not really hang with them. Regardless of their continued hazing of their new bass player, Metallica's appearance at Donington that year was said to have been a largely successful affair. That is, until they were wrapping up their set. It was at this point, you see, that the headliners of the show Bon Jovi arrived, flying in over the crowd in their helicopter, the noise from which obviously being a distraction, especially since they seemed to take a long time to make their way across the crowd before finally landing backstage. The incident was probably nothing, but Hetfield took it as a personal slight, as once they were done, he was said to have stormed off stage enraged as he grabbed a marker and scrawled "Kill Bon Jovi" across his guitar. Vengeance, though, would have to wait as Hetfield and Ulrich resumed their work on planning their next album. The pair gathered in Ulrich's newly soundproofed garage to review what they termed their riff tapes, which were the compilation of ideas they had recorded from things like sound checks or ideas that Lars had hummed to James, who then translated the idea onto his guitar. This was pretty normal. James and Lars typically seemed to take the lead when it came to assembling ideas and riffs into songs, with Ulrich apparently playing a crucial role in figuring out how all these riffs and ideas would be pieced together to make a singular song. Basically, according to Lars, they would find riffs that they felt were strong enough on their own to be the backbone of a song, and they would then work from there by going through the tapes looking for other riffs that could fit as choruses or bridges or whatever various pieces they might need, with Hetfield sketching out the structure of the song on charts. Now, in the past, it was at this point, after the pair got some rough sketches together, that they would bring them to the other members of the band looking for their input. This time, though, while Kirk would be invited to give a listen to their ideas to start figuring out the solos he would be adding to the songs, their new bass player would get no such invitation. Where Cliff's advice and input was sought and respected, Newsted wasn't even invited to the table. Now, the rest of the band would claim they did this because they only had 4 tracks to work with when demoing these songs, so they simply couldn't fit Jason or his ideas in at this stage. Which makes Kirk's comment about how they were waiting for Newsted to write something epic, but he just didn't make any huge contributions on the album, seem very disingenuous. I mean, expecting him to live up to Cliff Burton, the man who was instrumental in writing a song like Orion, is simply unfair. Especially right off the bat when he's the new guy and you're making sure he feels like he's the new guy. It's more than just that, though, as it's really an unrealistic expectation when you don't involve him in the writing process. Regardless, after 9 weeks of this process, Metallica had 9 songs demoed that were both structurally complex and technically demanding to play. According to Hammett, this was a product of the band's heavy touring schedule, as just by playing their back catalog of songs from Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets in particular, the members of Metallica were really at the top of their game. They had felt that Master had been the height of their technical abilities, because at the time that was the extent they could push themselves to. Yet after playing those songs night in and night out, they pushed themselves beyond their previous limits, so the riffs they were coming up with during that time were a product of this. Notably, none of these songs clocked in under 5 minutes, with all but 2 being over 6 minutes long, suggesting that they were not looking to compromise to get radio airplay. That being said, the success of the Garage Days EP had reportedly inspired Lars, who seemingly saw that they had a chance to become one of the biggest bands in the world. He just seemed to want to do it on his own terms. To record this new set of songs, Metallica chose to work out of LA's one-on-one studio, in part to be closer to their wives, as Lars, Kirk, and even Jason had all gotten married around this time. relationships that would all end within several years, as they all seemingly found the famed